Hey there everyone, it's Austin Bach, and today I don't have a deck or a draft to share with you because like most people I've been following the news of the latest banned and restricted announcement from Wizards of the Coast this morning, and I wanted to share some thoughts in a sort of a video essay format, which is something I haven't tried before, so let me know in the comments if this is something you like, if it's something you'd like to see more of, but anyway, if you weren't following the news, Wizards dropped a nuclear bomb on the standard format this morning by banning 4 cards, which were Attune with Aether, Rogue Refiner, Ramanap Ruins, and Rampaging Ferocidon. Basically just targeting the top 2 decks of the format, which they decided were too strong, and now we move forward. So I wanted to look at each of the 4 cards and I guess the rationale for why they went after them and my thoughts on each of the bannings. So let's get started. So starting with the first and most obvious one, Attune with Aether is the card that I felt was definitely the most deserving of banning. It just made the energy decks way too consistent. They got to be super greedy with their mana because they got to play a low land count and still be able to get to the late game and have enough lands to do all the busted things they could do in the mid game. Basically every hand that had an Attune with Aether and a green source in it was a keep, and you could rest easy that your mana was going to sort itself out, like almost guaranteed. And even if you drew it in the late game, it was just a great card because 2 energy is just valuable at any point in the game, which should not be true of your mana fixer slash early development fixer. So I think that was definitely the first card that needed to go. But Wizards apparently decided that wasn't far enough. They thought that the energy deck could feasibly survive an Attune ban, which I think makes sense to me. Don't want to take any chances. You want to make sure the deck continues to not dominate. So I think any of these 5 cards were really on the chopping block and could feasibly have been banned. They decided to go after Rogue Refiner, as we know, but I think that there's arguments for all 3, or all 5. Aether Hub was the one that I thought they would go after if they went after a second card, just because that's the card that let them continue to be greedy with their mana, splash powerful cards like Scarab God. And if you banned it and Attune, it would really force the deck into some holes, force them to stick to just 2 colors or make some much harder deck building decisions. Whirler Virtuoso is interesting also because it is the best energy payoff, but I think it kind of ignores the problem of energy, which is just how easy it is to obtain energy on the cheap from cards like Attune and Rogue Refiner. Once, if you cast a Whirler Virtuoso with no energy in your pool, it's not that strong, but it's much better if you cast it on like turn 6 when you have like 6 energy just lying around, which you really shouldn't have access to so early. So I think it's a totally fine card without all the busted enablers. Sort of like the Grape Shot versus Attune and Rogue Refiner are like the rituals. Like Grape Shot's not the problem in Modern. It's just all the payoffs that let Grape Shot go off once you're started doing busted things with your mana. Harness Lightning is interesting also because in the Teamer deck it was essentially just a Terminate. It could kill anything at any point in the game, but I think it incurs too much splash damage to the rest of the format because it's so valuable as a cheap removal spell. I think it hurts the format as a whole too much by taking it out. And then Longtusk Cub I think is the silliest of the 5 to get banned, but it is the one that they brought up in their article, which I'm going to link in the description. I think first of all, removing Attune with Aether from the format removes a lot of the snowball potential of Longtusk Cub, which is something they mentioned. And it was also just a card that energy decks were starting to move away from, because it's not very strong in the mirror. It has weaknesses to cards like Fatal Push. It's definitely not the problem card, so I'm glad that they didn't go in that direction, but it's worth noting. So now we move to the other end of the spectrum, which is Mono Red. Oh, I guess we should talk about Rogue Refiner first, but it's pretty clear why this one got the nod, because it's the producer, it's the card that let all the other cards do busted things. It's never bad, it's just always good. So moving on quickly, let's go to Ramanap Ruins. So the thing with the Mono Red deck is, I can only speak from my anecdotal evidence because I don't have the data backing me up that Wizards apparently has access to, but when I was testing online I ran into a lot of Mono Red, and I think it was secretly the best deck in the format. Teamer was certainly the most popular, And I think the fact that it had a slightly favorable matchup against mono red kind of masked the fact that mono red was secretly the best deck. You know, and part of the big part of that reason for that is that Ramanop Ruins is just so good. If you have 4 in your deck, it's like your opponent start the game with 6 or 8 less life than you do, which is a huge, a huge advantage. And the fact that it's a land rather than a spell, and you don't really have to make any decisions with your deck when you build, it's such a low investment cost when you compare it to a card like Hazoret, which was the other card people were talking about possibly banning. Hazoret, it costs 4 mana, and it has the very relevant clause of needing to have 1 or less card in your hand, which we saw at the Pro Tour when Yam Wing Chung made that big error against Paulo. It leads to interesting decisions, and you can't put it in a mid-range deck. You have to put it in a very low-to-the-ground deck and make decisions about your mana base and your suite of cheap spells in order to enable it. So I think it makes more sense to go after the Ramanap if you're looking to break up the consistency of this deck. Because, you take out Hazoret, that deck can still play Chandra at the 4, or Sand Strangler, which we've seen in some decks before, like Ben Stark's deck that almost won a GP. But the main thing with Ramanap Ruins is the inevitability, which is something we're going to get into later in this essay. The thing is, a mono red deck really should not have so much game in the super late game. If you're up against a control deck and the control deck is able to stabilize at like 6 or 8 life and then start doing what they're intending to be doing in the late game, the red deck should not have that additional reach. Like, you can build your deck in such a way that you still have that reach with cards like Lightning Strike and Shock, but Ramanap Ruins is just like a free way to ensure you can never lose a long game, which I think red decks just should not have. It kind of breaks the color disparity, which is something we're going to talk about. Now, the other card that I'm sure people are going to be confused about, definitely the most curious of the bunch that got banned, is the Rampaging Ferocidon. It was never a card that was in the conversation for banning in the community, but apparently Wizards decided, based on the data, that it just had too high of a win percentage, and it was too responsible for single-handedly winning games of any other card. And that's understandable. They have access to more data like that from Magic Online games. I can't really speak to that too much. But the interesting thing to me about this ban, which is what I want to spend the bulk of this essay talking about, is what this banning says about where the game is right now, where the format is, and what the state of interaction is in Standard at the moment. Because the thing about Rampaging Ferocidon is it hated so much on a lot of the incidental strategies, like tokens and just the normal ways that you would attack a mono red deck. It kind of invalidated, and we're going to look at a couple of them right now. So first of all, here's a couple cards that are not in Standard right now that really I feel should be, because white really got the short straw this time around in terms of cheap interaction. Because these are cards that we've seen in Standard in the past. Declaration in Stone and Stasis Snare just rotated recently. Immolating Glare also was right behind them. Celestial Purge we haven't seen in a while, but this is the kind of card that I think Standard really needs right now. A cheap instant speed interaction spell for white, which it is sorely lacking. White has access to Cast Out and Fumigate, but it really just doesn't have a good way to deal with an early onslaught from mono red. And Celestial Purge is the kind of card that it could really benefit from. And I feel the Standard would be a lot better right now if we had a card like Celestial Purge. And it's not like Wizards is averse to printing hate cards, because we've seen cards like the Defeat Cycle that specifically target a certain color or strategy. But the problem with the Defeat Cycle, in my mind, is it kind of incentivizes you to keep going down the bad paths. Like, if you look at a card like Ferocidon or Chandra, just red in general, like, the best answer to those cards are Chandra's Defeat, so you want to be playing red. And then once you're already playing red, you want to be playing those powerful cards like Chandra, Glorybringer, Ferocidon, so it kind of just exacerbates the problem. It's like a positive feedback loop that I think is kind of problematic for the Standard format. And here are some of the other interaction spells, kind of to exemplify my point. Every color except white has access to this cheap interaction, and I think the interaction in these colors is pretty good. Like, the games that involve these colors are pretty interactive. Like, even though the format was stale and the metagame was pretty, one note, the games themselves are interesting and involve interesting interactive decisions. I don't have any green cards on here because green, just naturally is interactive by nature of putting cheap creatures onto the board, like mana accelerants, or cheap blockers like Long Tusk Cub, or the dinosaurs like Ripjaw Raptor. So green is just naturally always going to have something in the early game to deal with something in the context of mono red. But in when we look at a card like Rampaging Ferocidon, the fact that white just has no good way of answering it just really causes the metagame to stagnate, because you really only have access to 3 or 4 colors in order to deal with the kind of threat that Rampaging Ferocidon poses, which I think is a big problem, and white really needs to catch up in the color pie. And I think banning Ferocidon helps with that a bit, because it removes one of the most problematic cards in order for them to interact in the early game in an efficient manner. And sort of to prove my point about the whole Rampaging Ferocidon hating on white so much, let's take a look at some of the ways that white has traditionally looked to fight against mono red in the past. All these are cards that should, in theory, be really good against mono red. Just cheap lifelink blockers, just pure life gain and ways to slow them down. Maverick Fane is a card in particular that's going to start seeing more play now that Vampires is getting more support. Just creating lifelink tokens every turn should in theory be good. Regal Caracal making a bunch of lifelink tokens. But none of these cards are any good in the face of a Rampaging Ferocidon, because it completely shuts off life gain, it punishes you for putting lots of cheap bodies into play, and just in general makes it so just the crux of what you're trying to do does not work at all against the Rampaging Ferocidon, because there's no way to get rid of it in a mana efficient manner. All these cards just get embarrassed completely, especially Authority of the Consuls, which was a card that people started playing for a while in Standard, but then once Rampaging Ferocidon picked up in sideboard play, that card no longer worked in any way against mono red. And Approach, tapping out for 7 mana sorcery, if you really need that life buffer in order to not die and be able to untap and start doing what you want to be doing with the blue-white control deck. So it's just such a big feel bad having Rampaging Ferocidon in the format, making it impossible for you to do fun things like black-white tokens or just anything in white. Just makes it really hard to interact, which I think is a good thing for the format, that is no longer something that is keeping the colors from being perfectly balanced with each other. So now the question everyone wants to know, what happens now? What is the format going to look like now that the top 2 decks have completely disappeared? Well, to be frank, I think it's open season. I think all the decks are viable contenders now. I think now that Temur is not the only creature deck you can play, other creature decks can start to come out of the woodwork. Tribal decks like dinosaurs, merfolk, vampires, those are all going to be good again now that their creatures just aren't getting outclassed at every spot on the curve. Black decks can go back to just killing creatures without having to worry about getting 2 for 1 every time by just good enter the battlefield triggers. Like I said, white's going to have more room to breathe, and they can do their thing without all the incidental hate. Blue, notably, is going to be able to regain the inevitability that they're supposed to have in the late game. Now that mono red no longer has that inevitability, blue can go back to being on top when the game goes long. Green gets neutered because it no longer has just the hyper efficient engine, but it still has all the good tribal cards like in dinosaurs and powerful creatures in the mid game. It can still do its thing. And red, like I said, no longer has the inevitability, but it still has some of the best cheap interaction in the format. Abrade, Lightning Strike, Harness Lightning. Red's gonna be fine. I think Scarab God is one card that people are concerned about being too good. I don't know if that's true. It is definitely pushing the boundary, and as the general power level of the format declines, just a super pushed card like Scarab God could potentially dominate. But luckily not as many decks are going to have access to it because the mana gets much worse without Attune with Aether. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see if the strategy of Scarab God is so much better than everything else that there's no reason not to play any other deck, which I hope is not the case, but we will definitely see. Now, kind of as a footnote, I want to talk for a minute about what this means for Wizards of the Coast in general and R&D, because I think it raises some concerning questions about their operations. I think the fact of the matter is the time between design and development and release is just simply too big. You know, R&D is trying to create answers for problems that happened over a year ago. Like, for instance, the Frostodon, if you read the article about why they decided to ban it, they actually intended it as an answer to the Saheeli Ray Felidar Guardian combo, which obviously got banned before Frostodon even got printed. And then the card just proved too efficient for the watered-down format that resulted when it entered the world. And I think that in their haste to kind of fix their past mistakes, they kind of shot themselves in the foot, and they're neglecting to consider the potential ramifications of the rest of the format. And I think that's just a product of the fact that it takes so long for them to print answers to cards. Like, you know, back in the day, Mardu Vehicles there was a time when people thought that deck would get banned, and then a couple months after like Gideon rotated and that deck was no longer the best deck, a Braid got printed, which if it had existed at the time that Mardu Vehicles was at its peak, I think it would have definitely helped to sort of level out the interaction in the format and make it so that deck wasn't as dominant. And I think Fatal Push was kind of the same thing, well, that got printed more recently, but or closer to the time that it was at its peak. But you know, I think that just the fact that it takes so long, and the fact that there seems to be so many, you know, dropped connections, or you know, R&D just doesn't seem to be communicating with itself properly between design and development. We saw that with the Felidar Guardian combo. We saw that with the entire energy mechanic just being too busted. And now apparently we're seeing it with Rampaging Frostodon, which is just more problematic. So I don't know if I can be super optimistic and say that this won't happen again. Hopefully that we're moving past the dark ages, as it were. We've seen 9 bannings in the past 12 months, which is definitely cause for concern. I am willing to give them some leeway because, you know, they're going to make mistakes, they're not perfect, but I think the past year and a half, if nothing else, has kind of demonstrated how crippling these mistakes can be and how long it can take to fix them, because the delay is so significant between them identifying a problem and trying to create ways to solve it in the upcoming releases. I do still have faith, you know, that the game will survive and will endure through this, because community is strong and very passionate, and R&D has shown that they're pretty transparent and willing to listen to player feedback. But I just hope that this isn't indicative of longer term health problems for a company that still operates like it's in the 90s. Frankly, you know, we've seen other games like Hearthstone and Elder Scrolls Legends that they do have the benefit of being digital and being able to nerf cards rather than just ban them. But I think Wizards really needs to be more introspective and look at how long it takes for them to put out sets and respond to problems in the metagame, because we can't just keep doing this. We can't keep banning 4 cards in a single cycle. You know, it's just not good for the long-term health of Standard. We're already seeing the format decline, and I am definitely concerned, and I don't think that these bannings are going to completely solve all of Standard's problems. Even though I do agree with all the bannings, I think that it's just kind of a snowball effect. From the first moment they banned a card, it kind of opened the floodgates and unbalanced all the hard work they did, partly due to their own mistakes, but partly because of the power vacuums that they started creating by banning cards. It just begets more problems. So long story short, I'm optimistic that we can move on from this, but I think the company is going to have to change their model a bit to ensure that this doesn't happen again. But that's about it. That's my thoughts on the matter. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. And thanks for watching. And I think in the next couple days I'll be posting my first draft videos and standard videos. Get back to my usual operations. But let me know if you were a fan of this or not. And either way, we will see you next time.